Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm Steve, and we are a member of the Agora Podcast Network. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find both by searching for A2Z History. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Joran and William at the Alexandria level. We also have Paul the Magnificent at Constantinople. I need to also thank Katya for her kind and generous donation on PayPal. Thank you very much, Katya. Definitely check out the new and improved History of the Papacy Patreon page at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. There we have, at the new Patreon, you'll get, as some of your benefits, there's many benefits, but one of the new benefits from the old Patreon is that you'll get an audio feed of our new YouTube series, which will launch soon, called The History of the Papacy in 10 Minutes. At every level, you will get ad-free episodes, as well as you will also get each episode published early in the History of the Papacy bonus feed. So definitely look for all of those, and at different levels you'll also be entered into a monthly drawing for History of the Papacy swag, as well as the History of the Papacy book drawing, which is really cool. Now, for today's episode, Moses had a great career, but he wasn't able to enter the Promised Land. The Old Testament picks up the rest of the story with the person who was able to lead the chaotic, violent, and sometimes boring narrative of the Hebrew people's conquest of Canaan. Come and listen as Garry Stevens and I take you on a guided tour of the Book of Joshua. I hope to see you on YouTube, Patreon, social media, right here on the podcast, and I will definitely talk to you next time. Welcome back to another exciting collaboration between the History in the Bible podcast and the History of the Papacy podcast. Today, our task will be to turn the microscope on one of the most interesting and controversial books of the Bible, that being the book of Joshua. Who was Joshua? Who wrote the book? Why would they write such a book? Many people have quite strong opinions on Joshua, including us, Garry and I. We are going to put Joshua on trial, but in a different way than we have in the past. So let's get into it. Garry, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. In splendid isolation.
Yeah, we should probably say at the point we are recording this episode in March of 2020, we are in the height of the coronavirus epidemic, you might say, pandemic. And so we are both completely quarantined. We're 6 feet or 2 meters, if you prefer. I don't want to, we're not going to offend anyone. We're well apart from each other. Actually, we're probably more close to about 10,000 miles apart right now. So we have more than enough social distancing right now, but we're not going to social distance on Joshua. Tell us let's get close to Joshua right now, Garry. Tell us a little bit about Joshua and the book of Joshua.
Let's start with the book itself. The book itself is considered to be the first of the histories in Christian tradition. In the Jewish tradition, it's considered to be the first of the former prophets or the early prophets. Joshua is located straight after Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy is basically Moses' many chapter-long valedictory speech to his people. Joshua tells the story of the Israelite conquest of what will soon be their homeland, ancient Canaan. It's a great story of conquest, full of blood and gore and violence, which I find a little disconcerting. And it is a story of triumph. The book depicts this period in the Israelites' history as one of the most perfect relationship with God that the Israelites ever have. Even under King David, the Israelites have somewhat of a trepidatious relationship with God in that David often does the wrong thing. But in this period under Joshua, the Israelites' conquest is one of an absolutely perfect relationship with God. This is as good as it will ever get in the entire history of the Israelites. God loves them, they love God, and in return, God gives them the promised land. The book itself is named after its leader, of course, Joshua, or in Hebrew, Yehoshua, which means God is salvation. His original name was Hoshea, and for reasons which the Bible doesn't actually specify, Moses changes his name to Joshua. Joshua is an unusual man in the sense that before the conquest, the Israelites have spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. At the end of that 40 years, there are precisely 3 men living who were born in Egypt: Moses, Caleb the spy, and Joshua. So the entire male generation before has been utterly annihilated. And even Moses himself, of course, will not make it into the promised land. Only Joshua and Caleb will. Now, oddly, in the Bible, you'd think Joshua would get a really good rap as being the great leader who saw the Israelites win their promised land and the land which would become their homeland for all eternity. But weirdly, after the book that's named after him, he hardly ever appears. Hardly ever. And when he does appear, or is mentioned, it's not often as a great warrior and leader. It's as Moses' successor. In the New Testament, I think he's mentioned a grand total of 2 times, just 2 times, that's it. And even in the rest of the Old Testament, he's hardly mentioned. So I find that a bit of a mystery. Why isn't he ranked up there with Abraham and Isaac and Moses? Just not quite sure. The book itself is divided exactly in half. The first 12 chapters tell the story of the conquest. The second 12 chapters, after the conquest has been brilliantly completed by Joshua and the Israelites. The second half is a really soporific story of which tribe gets which region and which towns. It's got to be...
It is brutally boring.
Yeah. I think it rivals the books of Chronicles for sheer soporific quality. It's just dreary. But I suppose
if anybody's ever there who's gotten what they might call their abstract on their house of who's owned the house before them, like my house, it goes back, the abstract goes back into the 1800s. Josiah so-and-so bought the tract in 1899 and it was sold to Henry blah blah blah, and that's Joshua to a T.
We're not quite sure when the book was actually written. One clue is in fact those 12 boring chapters at the end, because the towns named seem to correspond to the distribution of lands during the time of King Josiah, which is centuries later, towards the very end of the kingdom of Judea. So maybe the book wasn't written until then. Others say, no, the distribution given in the last 12 chapters is quite probably the distribution under Solomon, King Solomon. So that would still make it written centuries after the time it was set. As to when this actually happened, the events it purports to record, they can be no earlier than 1200 BC. Now, let me give you an anchor for that. King David is 1000 BCE, pretty much exactly. Nice, easy number, date, and person to remember. So the whole thing, and 1200 BC, why is that the earliest time? Until then, the period before 1200 BC, for several centuries, is called the Late Bronze Age. This is one of the rare times in ancient history when Egypt maintained an empire outside its homeland. Until 1200 BC, Egyptian forts dotted Canaan, which was a subsidiary province of Egypt. So it's impossible that either the Exodus or the book of Joshua happened before then, because it was an Egyptian province. So it has to have happened after 1200 BC. Now, 1200 BC is another important date, because that's the beginning of a cataclysm called the Bronze Age collapse. The Bronze Age collapse lasted about 50, maybe 100 years, and the entire Middle East was thrown into turmoil. Egypt was kicked out of Canaan. It was attacked by the mysterious sea peoples, who may or may not have been Greeks, or who knows. The Hittites were destroyed and disappeared from history, right through to the entire region was thrown into absolute cataclysm. cities were razed to the ground throughout the area. And this period lasted for, as I said, maybe 100 years or so. And after that, we see the emergence of the early Iron Age. So it could be that Joshua's time is placed in this period, in the Bronze Age collapse. And it's part of that. We're really not quite certain.
What is maybe the modern Jewish interpretation of Joshua, or modern being even into the rabbinical period? Have you gotten into that in your research? What they think about him?
Until this century, I think Joshua was perceived both by Christians and Jews as a story of triumph, as a story of a mighty leader, as the book presents itself to be. It wasn't until after the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust that people started saying, maybe this sort of a let's kill all the Canaanites thing is a little bit on the nose. But until quite recently, how it's viewed today, I think still most Jews and Christians would regard it as a book of triumph, really.
I did a little research into the Christian interpretation of it, just because I always like to see what they're saying about it now. I really, up until fairly recently, this was one of the ones where in Christianity, there's always the battle between the historical and the allegorical view on the Old Testament. And this is one of the ones where a lot of the people, they'll try and draw a really heavy, dark line between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Oh yeah, Joshua is all allegorical, and the Yahweh of the Old Testament, he wasn't necessarily a bad guy, but let's just forget about all that, all the stuff that we've talked about in the past, like Samson, and we're talking about Joshua. Let's kind of just we'll blur them out a little bit. Yeah, they're there, but Jesus is the big guy, and really anything, we'll really pay attention to things that we say that have prefigured Jesus in the Old Testament, and we'll kind of forget about the stuff about killing everyone that happened in the Old Testament. There was an interesting article that I had read from an Orthodox Christian, priest, who said that Joshua is probably one of the most difficult Old Testament books to interpret, because if you really play that game of, oh yeah, everything in the Old Testament's really just problematic, and let's really focus on the New Testament, then you're really you're becoming a Marcionite at that point. Or if you just say that, oh, it's a historical document of the real politic of the day, and it has no meaning for religion for today, that's also either a cop-out at best or straight Marcionism. And the United States Conference of Roman Catholic Bishops, they had a write-up that was basically to that point too, that it's a really difficult book to jive with what they're really trying to say in Christianity. The whole thing, that whole half of the book where they go and they kill every single living creature in the town. It's hard to jive that with the Christian message. And I think if you rewind all the way back to Marcion, that's what he was getting at.
Okay, now I want to pick you up on that, continue that just in a second. But let's give our listeners an example of the campaigns in the book of Joshua. The book describes 3 campaigns. Each of them are launched out of the highlands or the hills of Canaan, which are basically a mountainous area which runs alongside the River Jordan. So it's in the east section. The western section of Canaan are basically plains, and these mountains run along the eastern side. So each campaign is launched from this really rough and ready area. There are 3 campaigns. One is into northern areas, one into middle, and one into southern. The campaign is usually launched from the hills, which are pretty close to Jerusalem, a few kilometers north of Jerusalem. So that's literally in the middle of Canaan. Most of the action takes place actually in the area of the tribe of Benjamin. And the tribe of Benjamin was one of those tribes which in later times lay on the boundary between the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes. The book of Joshua tends to be very pro the northern tribes. So remember, there's 10 in the north and there's 2 big ones in the south. Because most of the action takes place there, which is interestingly the exact opposite attitude of its Joshua's successor book, the Book of Judges, which hates the northern tribes. But anyway, in these campaigns, of which there are many famous scenes, a typical battle goes like this. Okay, Joshua 10:28. That day Joshua took, well, in English it'd be Macabre, I suppose, but apparently it's Macabre or something. Anyway, I'll read mine. That day Joshua took Macabre. He put the city and its king to the sword and totally destroyed everything in it. He left no survivors. And he did to the king of Macabre as he had done to the king of Jericho. And time and again, you will find that the book describes Joshua. He invades a town and he destroys everything. He destroys the men, the women, the children, sometimes the trees. And that happens again and again. But this sort of account seems to be fairly common in the Middle East. For example, you find the Assyrian kings saying exactly the same sort of. So here's an account by King Sennacherib, and it says, "In my first campaign, I accomplished the defeat of Merodach-Baladan, king of Babylonia. In the midst of that battle, he deserted his camp, and he escaped alone. The chariots, horses, wagons, mules, which he left behind at the beginning of the battle, my hands seized. I entered jubilantly into his palace. I took his gold, silver, precious stones, goods and property, his harem, courtiers, official singers." You can see the man cackling. So this, admittedly, does seem to be conventional rhetoric, whether it's true or not.
This is tough for me when I'm making this my job to convince you that it's not that, that Joshua's not that big of a deal, because who is Joshua? None of it really quite lines up to, is it historical? So if it's historical, then the Israelites, these writers 250, maybe 300 years later, are just copying Assyrian archetype writers. There was a book I had read that was called Against the Grain, and it's the subtitle is A Deep History of the Earliest States by the author's name is Richard Manning, and he writes a lot about different groups and how they interacted. It was basically the agricultural states, which maybe like Jericho and those early Canaanite states would have been, versus the more nomadic peoples who, in this case, the Israelites would have been. So in that telling, the Israelites would have been the good guys. But then you twist it around, and if the Israelites were, in fact, a offshoot of a mercenary tribal people who had served under the Egyptians, who, for whatever reason, were either spun off of the Egyptians or didn't want to work for the Egyptian more, and then they go in and just basically start taking over these Canaanite sites, which would have been basically kind of related people to them, kind of cousins. They would have spoken a fairly similar language. They would have had a fairly similar religion. Then clearly the Israelites are the bad guys in that scenario. It really depends on what perspective you look at them from, whether what they're doing is justified or if it's completely unjustified. So I'm a really bad I took your Hasatan hat today. Okay. It's too bad we're recording this for video and I didn't make a Hasatan hat, but it's really difficult to make a coherent case against or for Joshua, because it's so blurry who Joshua is.
You mean Joshua the man or the whole Israelites?
Either one. If Joshua is the leader of these Israelites, I mean, if you take Joshua and the idea that he's basically Moses light, he comes in, especially the more boring parts of Moses where he's giving a detailed exemplar. The curtains for the holiest of holies have to be 3 cubits by 6 cubits. Not 1/2 cubit more or less. And that's basically what the second half of Joshua is, after he's killed a bunch of people and presumably enslaved them. I mean, I don't think they talk about enslaving, but come on, there was a lot of it. There must have been some enslaving in there. Let's not mince words here.
Yeah. Actually, Joshua as Moses light, the book does give us several incidents where Joshua is exactly that. The classic one is just before the invasions, where the Israelites are gathered to the east of the River Jordan, and they're looking at Canaan. And what happens is the priests bring out the Ark of the Covenant, and the Jordan dries up so that they can march across it to get into Canaan. So Moses crossed the entire Red Sea, and Joshua gets to cross a little stream. So that is a classic example. And there are some other instances where Joshua basically does something just like the great Moses, but it's several orders of magnitude more pathetic. But they do try to make the effort to draw back.
I think for me, there's two different Joshuas and two different Israelites. If we look at it from the standpoint of Israelites, now, if I'm not mistaken, one of the possible datings of the writing of the book of Joshua is just about the time of the Persian conquest of Palestine.
That would be a fairly late date, I think. It's possible, but it'd still be fairly late. Well, we don't know how long these things took to edit. They could have been centuries in progress. Yes, that's possible.
So let's say we take that one just for example, so that maybe that is a little late. But the Israelites are really small players in the big Western Asia game that's going on with the, tiny. I had seen somewhere that the Persians had a mosaic or a stela where they had all the different peoples who had basically bowed the knee to the Persians, and all the big players were in there. I believe the Philistines were in there, the Egyptians, even the Ionian Greeks, who were basically as far away from as you could get to the Persians, and they were tiny players. But no Israelites in there, no Judeans, no, none of them. So I think, so what do you do if you're trying to counteract that? You see that you want to be players too. Well, let's write a book about it.
We once were great and still are.
And I think that, so if you look at it from that point, how can you really be angry about Joshua, about something that just probably didn't happen?
Okay. As we've discussed before, Steve, I don't like the book of Joshua because it has so many of these ugly moments of kill. And actually, one thing about the kill, it isn't just wanton slaughter. They use a very specific term. I'll get the Hebrew pronunciation wrong, but it's something like karem.
Yeah.
And in English, that's often translated as devoted to destruction. Harem refers to an object or a person, or it could be anything, which you destroy as a sacrifice to God. It is God's bounty, plunder, a prize for giving you victory. In battle, you must destroy these things, and you're not allowed to use them yourselves. And in fact, there's one incident in the book of Joshua with a guy called Achan. And Achan, instead of going through, whatever town they've just conquered and destroying everything, he grabs some of the gold and silver for himself. And then God, at the next town they come to and says, no, one of you guys has been naughty. Joshua does some detective work, finds out that Achan has stolen some of these goods and kept them for himself and not given them to God. And the Israelites first stone and then burn to death his entire family. So they took it very seriously. And this concept of devoted to destruction does seem to have been used by other Middle Eastern peoples too. So it wasn't just an Israelite thing. I still find it. It's at
very
best
distasteful.
unpleasant. Yeah, that's it. Yes,
it's distasteful.
At best, it's distasteful. Yeah.
As I read through Joshua, it just doesn't. The narrative doesn't make sense. It makes very much sense in the Iron Age context. It doesn't make sense in the Bronze Age context, to me at least. I mean, I guess I should always preface that I'm not a scholar of these things. But, doing my readings as a people, if they really are a group, whatever their situation was when they left Egypt, I mean, let's aver that they were actually they came out of Egypt. And Jericho was the first town that they hit. what is their intrinsic motivation to completely destroy it? I guess you could say that there are some motivations to completely destroy this town, but to me it seems like a good place to, I don't, I guess militarily, to take hold, enslave the population, take their grain. It had a well, so it was a water source for them to move up the Jordan Valley to the richer places and maybe the more organized places.
Yeah, I take your point, and actually, there's that relates to a story which I think was told of when the king of Persia conquered the Medians. And the story goes, the king of Persia has conquered Media, and he has the king of Media or Media there, and he's gloating at the king of Media. And the king of Persia says, "See how I am destroying your cities." And the king of Media says, "No, sire, I see that you are destroying your cities." Yeah. So what is the point of destroying a whole city? But on the other hand, something which has always intrigued and puzzled me is the entire concept of sacrifice at all. Throughout the Middle East, and particularly by the Israelites, they sacrificed constantly throughout their history. You always meant to go up to Jerusalem for the big festivals and sacrifice some grain or a pigeon or something like that, or a goat or an oxen. And I've often wondered, these are people often on the edge of starvation. Canaan isn't part of the rich, fertile crescent. It's a fairly unimpressive place. And yet these people willingly sacrifice a moderate proportion of their agricultural product constantly. So why do they do that? Admittedly, I think, destroying the entire city of Jericho is an order of magnitude greater, but still on a continuum. And I've never found an answer for why these people sacrifice their agricultural product. I've never seen a scholarly paper saying, yes, well, it does this and does this and does.
Yeah, why is there a psychological reason or even an economic reason for this destruction of a pretty significant portion of their agricultural produce?
Yeah. I mean, is there a social reason? Is it because this sacrificing imposes some sort of social order and cohesion on the people? That's a possibility, but I don't know how. Yeah.
There's a theory that I guess in the hierarchy of theories out there, my main theory is that it just didn't really happen and that the writers of Joshua just kind of made it up as they went. But there is a military historian, Richard Gabriel, who kind of gives a interesting theory and a possible theory of what happened with Joshua, that the Hebrews, I think he had written an entire book about this, that the Hebrews were a mercenary group who had come from Canaan originally, and they had this Canaanite religion, they had this Canaanite language. They go to Egypt, which that kind of fits in with the actual history and the archaeology. They go and they went and they set up into Egypt, and then for whatever reason they leave. That gives us the Exodus story. And when they go into Canaan, they don't go after, if you look at a map of ancient, basically, if we think about it in the terms of modern day Israel, they avoid what's the Gaza Strip, which is the Mediterranean coast, what you might call the western coast, where the Philistines lived, and they had 5 major cities, the Pentapolis. They avoided those cities because really, if you look at those major cities, the Philistines had a pretty organized structure, and they were fairly well organized militarily. So if you're a raiding band, which kind of fits in with what Moses and that whole book of Exodus says, that's a really difficult target to hit. A group of people who are organized, they have places they can fall back into. They have mutual support amongst these 5 cities. So let's skip those and let's skip over the Jordan River into the Jordan River Valley with these Canaanite kingdoms who are completely isolated from each other. Each one is their own kingdom. And the book of Joshua kind of gives hints of that, where Jericho kind of defends itself. And then after Jericho's taken, then those other kings try of the northern part of the Jordan Valley try to join up together. And if you place it into that context, then Joshua goes and he takes Jericho, which is pretty much oh, is that an airplane? That's actually a very good sign for us. We usually don't like airplanes, but airplanes are good. Let's enjoy the airplane right
now. First one today. It's landing, so I presume it's bringing in Australian citizens who are trapped somewhere or something.
Yeah, in March 2020, we're not going to complain about airplanes.
Nah.
But so if we look at Joshua, he's taking Jericho he's making an example out of Jericho. Now, does that temper you at all that Jericho was the weak link? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, just on the Philistines, they do seem to have been quite well organized. And presumably, even if they were besieged, they could support each other by sea and be in contact by sea. Whereas the Canaanites don't seem to have had any cohesion at all, do they? It's very late where they get themselves together, as you said, into some sort of alliance and try to attack the Israelites. Just one thing on Jericho. According to the current archaeology, there is no evidence that Jericho was actually in existence, occupied, at any time that we can put to Joshua.
Yeah.
So
that's where everything gets tricky, because archaeology does not line up with the textual evidence at all. So we're just really, we're kind of, I don't know what the word we might, we're definitely doing it, but I'm not going to let the scholars off either. They're kind of making it up as they go along too.
Well, that's true. I mean, archaeological digs in Canaan are actually fairly recent. That is the past 50 years.
Yeah.
And they've only, in that period, worked out that there is no evidence for some sort of structured invasion of Canaan, which led to the widespread destruction of cities. The destruction layers just aren't there. The occupation just isn't there. I mean, I'm actually prepared to believe that Joshua is a complete fantasy invented for later generations to show that the Israelites were a great people, but I'm just annoyed that it's in them. I'm also annoyed by Samson, for that matter, the homicidal half-wit. I can't stand him.
Yeah, we can always dig Samson up again. I think Samson is in a lot of ways, Samson makes me mad because Samson is all Samson is a copy of Hercules.
Yeah, good point.
And I think that's, I'm sure that'll get a negative comment or two somewhere along the way. But I really do think that Joshua is Assyrian envy.
It's a funny concept. Oh, those Assyrians love the way they kill and murder. Oh, yeah. Assyrian envy, yeah.
And I think, because the Israelites in this group, they co-evolved, all these people, the Assyrians and the Canaanites, they all worshipped a similar type of religion. They all had a certain, interrelated language and certain interrelated culture. It makes a lot of sense that Joshua and they would try to glom onto that a bit, because that was what the going concern was at that time. Even if you fast forward a couple of 100 years after either when Joshua was supposed to happen or when he was written, Julius Caesar wrote a whole set of books about how he had done basically the same thing to the Gauls, and he's proud of it. That was the thing to do at that time.
Or even right through the Middle Ages, the Crusades, the 19th century colonial period. In my own country, we massacred the Aborigines, left, right and centre. What a terrible. So, it really was quite common. And actually, just one thing on Assyrian envy. The Israelites do seem to have had a thing for the Assyrians, because apparently the law codes and the Ten Commandments seem to be modeled on late Assyrian period treaties, which the Assyrians imposed on their vassal subjects. And the key point is, unique amongst various treaties in the Middle East, the Assyrians commanded their vassals to love them. Other people is just, obey us, pay your taxes. But the Assyrians said, no, you must also love the king. And that, again, is in the Bible. You are commanded to love God. So most scholars today say that a lot of the law-y stuff throughout the entire Old Testament is based on, I suppose, envy of the Assyrian vassal treaties. I think that's an interesting point.
I think there's also an interesting point to be made amongst, it was really the three kingdoms that Joshua conquered. It was Jericho, Ai, and is it Gibeon or Gideon? Or is it both of them are used interchangeably?
Yeah, it's in the translations I've been using, the New Revised Standard Version, it's given as Gibeon. In Hebrew, it's Gavon.
And so
I found Gibeon.
Those are the three big ones, is the Gibeonites, the Ai, and the Jericho. And Jericho gets wiped out really quickly. And it's that was one of the ones that Richard Gabriel, the military historian, he really goes into detail about how a group of mercenaries would have taken a city like Jericho, that in the big scheme of things, as it was in the Bronze Age, really wasn't well defended. It was a pretty small town that had what was called a casement wall. And a casement wall was that the wall was the defensive wall around the town was basically hollow. And inside of that hollow cavity of the wall, during peaceful times, it might be used for storage of grain, storage of different commodities. People also might put apartments into there, or importantly for the book of Joshua, maybe even a brothel in there. And if the Hebrews had taken and gone in really quickly before, if a city that's surrounded by a casement wall, what those casements were really meant to do was those hollow spaces, you would fill them up with dirt and junk and anything you could fill in there, because that's really hard to attack with siege engines. You can hit them with all sorts of rocks from whatever the siege engines of that siege machinery of that time were, and they can absorb all of that impact over the course. They're really hard to take, a casement wall. But if Joshua had gone in there before then and made contact with that woman, what was her name?
Rakav, the prostitute?
The prostitute. If he had made contact with them and gone in there with, basically a bunch of elite soldiers, I think that's where Richard Gabriel really falls down, is he's taking it as a, like as if a modern Navy SEALs or SAS had gone in there. Maybe that's taking it a bit far. But I think that there is something to say that if, again, we have to preface this in the model of that Jericho actually existed at this point. It's a weak point. You take Jericho, you make a major league point that we're going to destroy the heck out of Jericho. Then you know what? Gideon and I, we're here and we're going to deal with you next. And that's really what they do in the book of Joshua, is that then they form a confederation that they try to deal with the Israelites.
Actually, just on Gibeon, this is my favorite part of the book because it's actually sort of funny. As you said, the Israelites have gained a reputation as mighty conquerors. And the inhabitants of the little town of Gibeon are going, whoa, these guys look like trouble. Okay, what are we going to do? So they set out from Gibeon, a little town which is actually not far from where the Israelites are encamped at that time. And they come out in disguise. They're dressed in ancient clothing, which looks like they've been traveling for miles and miles and miles. They've got worn out water skins. And they come to Joshua and they say, man, we've been walking for months, and we have heard of your greatness. And tell you what, if you won't destroy us, we will agree to be your subjects and slaves. How does that sound? And Joshua goes, oh, okay, cool. We don't even have to spend any effort on conquering you, because you will be our slaves forever. Great. And then a couple of days later, Joshua finds out that the Gibby Knights are not from some distant nation. They're just down the road. And he's outraged. He's outraged that the Gibby Knights are trying to preserve themselves from destruction. And the Gibby Knights basically say, well, yeah, of course we said this to you. And we got your word in a treaty because we didn't want to be destroyed. And Joshua, I mean, that never actually occurs to him. He doesn't seem to have been the brightest bulb in the pack. So I find that a funny little story. So in the end, the Israelites agree, okay, we can't go back on our word, but you'll be hewers of wood and something of water and our slaves forever. And they go, okay, fine, it's better than being wiped out.
You know who that reminds me of? The helots of the Spartans. You know, you're basically, all right, we're going to be the military elite, and you're going to be our slaves who allows us to be the military elite. Again, is that something that's being written in light of understanding, you know, who the Spartans are, maybe that's how the Philistines act? Again, you know, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I don't know this inside and out, but you know what? Honestly, a lot of the scholars seem to be making it up as they go along too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think if you've listened and watched any of our collaboration along the way, you see that the scholars are working off of a lot of the same data that we are. And it's a little questionable because there just isn't anything to work off.
Yeah, there's so much. The time scales are loose and fuzzy. We can only rely on pottery for dating things. There's no people. And certainly the period from 1200 to 1000, the chronology is really dodgy. And yeah, so the whole period is a mess to examine and write a history of.
Then wasn't there a point in the text where Joshua kills some of the kings of the Canaanites?
Oh, yeah. Yes, there is.
I mean, that's not helping my case right now, but I think I have a point. I might have a point to build off of that if he really did kill these kings.
Let me read you the passage in question. Let me read it to you. This is after the Battle of the Five Kings, which is after Jericho and the kings have got together and said, yeah, these guys look like a problem. Let's do something. Anyway, this is a battle which occurs outside of the city of Gibeon. The Gibeonites are not participating because they've sworn to be slaves to the Israelites. And this is the battle where the sun stands still for a day. Well, the passage actually doesn't say why and what the consequences are. It just happens. Anyway, Joshua wins a great battle against the five kings. And then at Joshua 10:24, and when the kings were brought out to Joshua, Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and ordered the army officers who had accompanied him, come forward and place your feet on the necks of these kings. And after that, Joshua had them put to death and impaled on 5 stakes. And they remained impaled on the stakes until evening. And at sunset, Joshua ordered them taken down from the poles and thrown into a cave.
And I think that there's so many examples along the way from that point all the way up until basically our modern time of humiliating kings like that. In our own U.S. history, this one struck me because I'm doing a collaboration with another podcaster on something that happened in American history, the Lewis and Clark expedition, and it doesn't directly have anything to do with Lewis and Clark, but William Clark had an older brother, George Rogers Clark, who was really critical in winning the U.S. Revolutionary War against Great Britain, and he doesn't really get a lot of attention because he really fought in what they would call Indian Wars. He fought mostly Native Americans in what was called the Far West at that point, which was really anything further west than Chicago. So not any more than 2/3 or a third of the continent over, but he hatcheted using a hatchet of several Native American leaders, kings, and he made a big deal of killing them himself. And I think that relates to Joshua killings, that you do this as a way of subjugating people. And it's not a popular way that we do things today. But by today, I mean post like basically 1960.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got to keep what we, what has in the basically the last 50 years, if you're listening past anything past what your grandparents, because your great grandparents, this probably happened when they're in their adulthood, things like this. Things were very different the way you subjugated people, and it was just very commonplace not too long ago. And it definitely happened in the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age.
Yeah. I mean, if you want recentness, I mean, what's it called? The Lord's Resistance Army in Africa, which basically, I think it's still around, just goes around hatcheting people, massacring them. So yeah, it still happens.
That's what has happened throughout history. Is it's very ugly. But in the way, I don't understand Joshua. I guess in a way, I do see Joshua's evolution, that he killed everybody in Jericho to make a point, but then he enslaves the people, the next step of people, the Gideonites and the people of Ai. That does seem like the next progression. If that really did happen, that's probably how things would go.
Oh, in the sense of, okay, the first city you make a total example of by annihilating it. And so you'll get less resistance, and then we don't have to annihilate the other ones because we've made our point. So we'll just take all the booty.
Because how can he afford to after that point? Because if the Israelites are a band of people who are nomads, which that's textual too, that they don't have a land, they've got to feed their people someplace. They have to keep the Levites burning stuff someplace, and they're not going to do it with the Philistines, who are controlling a major avenue to the west of them. It's not going to happen there. It's probably not going to happen too far to the east either, where you're getting into pretty severe desert and other pretty difficult people. So you've got to do it in that Jordan Valley.
Yeah. Have we got anything more to say or talk?
So do you think, to wrap it up, have I taken hatred or loathing?
Look, I'll take in everything on board. And as late as, well, probably last week, people have been doing horrors like this somewhere on the planet. Okay, I'll give you that. But my beef is still, in a book which is to billions of people, the very foundation of their morality, there is this. But I suppose I could take the attitude that we should be grateful there's not more of it.
Yeah.
There could have been a lot more of it in the Bible, and it's pretty much restricted to the book of Joshua. So let me say, it's not my favorite book, and I'm down from hating to merely disgruntled.
I would say for me, in the last couple of weeks, I've had a little bit more time on my hands to organize my bookshelf. I haven't put it in top of my bookshelf, but I also haven't put it in the recycling box either. It's in the bottom. I'm not quite ready to throw it out yet. And okay. I think that's maybe where they stood in the canon too.
Yeah.
You really can't throw it out, but you can't throw it in the recycling box, but we'll put it in the basement next to that the cookbook that you haven't used in 20 years. We'll do that.
Yeah. And maybe you could say that the book is redeemed by its second half, which is so mind-deadlingly soporific, it cancels out the horrors of the first half.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and we will talk to you soon.
So long from us.